First story, The Stranger in the Shadows by Sarah Mitchell. The summer of 2019, my friends and I decided to embark on a camping trip to the remote woods of Shawnee National Forest in Wyoming. We were excited for a week of nature, campfires, and starry nights. Little did we know, it would be a week filled with dread. Our group consisted of 4 people: me, Sarah, Mark, my boyfriend, Lily, and her fiancé, Tom. We had picked a secluded spot deep in the forest, far away from the main trails, to have a truly authentic experience. As the sun dipped below the horizon on our second night, that's when things started to get unsettling. It was Mark's turn to stoke the campfire, while the rest of us huddled around, roasting marshmallows. An eerie silence enveloped us, broken only by the crackling of the flames. That's when I noticed it. A faint rustling in the trees. I tried to dismiss it as just the wind, but it was too rhythmic for comfort. Lily, who had a keen sense for these things, spoke up. "Did you guys hear that? It sounds like someone's out there." Her voice trembled. Tom shrugged it off, blaming it on our overactive imaginations. But the tension in the air refused to dissipate. We decided to investigate, leaving our campfire behind. As we ventured deeper into the woods, the rustling grew louder, and it became evident that there was someone else in those woods with us. We approached a clearing and stopped dead in our tracks. In the moonlight, we saw a man, hunched over and fiddling with something on the ground. He was muttering to himself, seemingly unaware of our presence. My heart raced as we realized he was carving something into a tree, and it didn't look like innocent graffiti. As if he sensed us, the man suddenly stood up and turned towards us. His eyes gleamed eerily in the dark. It was impossible to make out his features, but he looked disheveled and wild. His gaze sent a chill down my spine. Without uttering a word, we turned and bolted back to our campsite, panic gnawing at us. We barely spoke a word as we doused our campfire and decided it was best to pack up and leave. We didn't want to confront the strange man, not knowing what he was capable of. We made our way back to our car in a hurry, constantly glancing over our shoulders. It felt like the forest itself was closing in on us, an oppressive presence that left us all shaken. As we finally reached the car, we sped away from that place, never looking back. To this day, we don't know who that man was or what he was doing there. But the memory of those crazed eyes still haunts my dreams. Second story, The Unsettling Firewood Collector by David Johnson. It was late September, and I decided to take a solo camping trip to the Shawnee National Forest in southern Illinois. I've always found solace in nature, and the thought of spending a few days completely isolated was enticing. Little did I know that I would encounter something that would make my solitude unbearable. The first few days were serene, and I relished the quiet of the woods. But on the 4th night, something changed. I was sitting by the campfire, reading a book, when I heard footsteps approaching from behind. Startled, I turned around and saw a man, hunched over and dragging a large sack. He didn't look like a typical camper. He was disheveled, with unkempt hair and a tattered jacket. I greeted him cautiously, asking if he needed any help. He just nodded and gestured to his sack, mumbling something about collecting firewood. Something about the situation felt off, but I decided to give him the benefit of the doubt and return to my book. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me. Every now and then, I would glance up to find his eyes fixed on me, an unsettling grin on his face. As night fell, he continued to collect firewood, his sack growing heavier. I noticed he was avoiding the logs and branches I had set aside for my own fire, and instead, he ventured deeper into the woods. It was as if he didn't want me to see what he was gathering. Trepidation washed over me, and I couldn't ignore my gut feeling any longer. I packed up my campsite, leaving the firewood collector behind, and decided to hike back to my car. The forest, once my sanctuary, had become a place of dread. It wasn't until I reached the parking lot that I noticed something chilling. My car had been tampered with. The doors were ajar, and the inside was in disarray. My heart pounded as I realized that the man from the woods might have followed me. I didn't hesitate. I jumped into my car and sped away, my thoughts consumed by the unsettling stranger and his disturbing intentions. To this day, I can't help but wonder what he was collecting in that sack and why he was so fixated on me. Third story, The Mysterious Disappearances by Anonymous. In the summer of 2017, I embarked on a camping trip with my friends in the remote forests of Vosges, France. What was supposed to be a serene escape from the city soon turned into a harrowing experience. We were a group of 5, including myself, Emma, Mike, Anna, and Mark. We had set up camp near a small, pristine lake in the heart of the forest. The first few days were filled with laughter, fishing, and hiking, but on the 4th night, something inexplicable happened. We were all gathered around the campfire when we heard distant cries for help. They were faint at first, but as they grew louder, we realized that someone was in desperate need of assistance. Without a second thought, we grabbed our flashlights and followed the sounds into the forest. The cries led us to a small clearing where we found a tent, half shredded and abandoned. It looked as if a fierce animal had torn through it. Fear gripped us as we noticed the belongings scattered around. It was clear that someone had been camping there, but there was no sign of the camper. We decided to search the immediate area for any signs of the person who had been in distress. As we moved deeper into the woods, the cries continued, but they seemed to be coming from different directions, making it impossible to pinpoint the source. The forest grew darker, and we felt the oppressive weight of the trees closing in on us. Fear gnawed at us as the cries for help intensified, and it became clear that something was terribly wrong. Panic set in as we realized that our group was now separated in the dense woods, and our flashlights began to flicker. For hours, we called out to each other, stumbling through the underbrush, but there was no sign of our friends. It was as if the forest had swallowed them whole. The cries for help echoed all around, growing louder and more haunting. Eventually, I stumbled upon the remains of a campfire. It was still smoldering, and next to it, I found a crude map. The map marked an area deeper into the forest, and the cries for help were now emanating from that direction. With trepidation, I followed the map's directions, the cries drawing me deeper into the darkness. What I encountered there was beyond my worst nightmares. I found Anna, lying motionless on the forest floor, her face etched with terror. I tried to revive her, but she was unresponsive. Panic surged through me as I realized that Mark, Mike, and Emma were still missing. I radioed for help, and the authorities arrived the next morning. Despite an extensive search, they never found any trace of the missing campers. It was as if the forest had swallowed them whole, leaving us with no answers. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that there was something malevolent in those woods, something that lured us into its grasp and claimed our friends. Fourth story, The Silent Stalker by James Anderson. It was the fall of 2018, and I decided to go camping alone in the Shawnee National Forest in Pennsylvania. The solitude of the forest was comforting, but that comfort turned to unease when I realized I wasn't alone after all. For the first 3 days, I reveled in the quiet beauty of the forest. But on the 4th night, I heard something strange. It was a soft whispering, like someone murmuring just beyond my campsite. My heart raced as I strained to listen, trying to decipher the words. It was impossible to make out the conversation, but the voices sounded distant yet strangely close. I considered that it might be other campers nearby, so I cautiously approached the direction of the voices, moving through the trees as quietly as I could. The closer I got, the clearer the voices became, and they were speaking in hushed tones, as if they didn't want to be overheard. I felt a growing sense of dread as I realized that there was no campsite, no tents, just the eerie voices. They weren't speaking any language I recognized. As I continued to approach, I stepped on a twig, causing it to snap loudly. The voices immediately fell silent. Panic surged through me as I realized that I was now the one being watched. I retreated to my campsite, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, hidden in the shadows, watching my every move. I huddled in my tent, clutching a knife, as the hours passed in agonizing silence. The next morning, I decided to cut my trip short and hastily packed up my camp. As I left, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone emerge from the woods. To this day, I wonder who those mysterious whisperers were and what they wanted. I haven't been able to find an explanation, but the feeling of being watched still haunts me. 5th story, The Uninvited Guests by Maria Rodriguez. In the summer of 2020, my family and I decided to take a camping trip to the Adirondack Mountains in upstate New York. We were looking forward to a peaceful retreat, but what we encountered was far from tranquil. Our group included my husband, Javier, our 2 children, Sofia and Diego, and our close friends, Lisa and Mark. We set up camp near a serene lake, surrounded by lush forest. The first few days were filled with swimming, hiking, and campfire stories, but on the 4th night, our vacation took a sinister turn. It was a warm evening, and we were gathered around the campfire, laughing and roasting marshmallows. The forest was alive with the sounds of crickets and frogs. But then, we heard something that sent shivers down our spines. Footsteps. It wasn't the usual rustling of leaves or the casual wandering of forest animals. It was deliberate, methodical, and it was coming closer. We all fell silent and strained to hear more. Soon, the footsteps were accompanied by hushed whispers, as if someone was plotting in the darkness. We grabbed our flashlights and cautiously approached the source of the sounds. Our hearts raced as we discovered 2 men standing by the edge of the lake, seemingly unaware of our presence. They were muttering to each other, their faces shrouded by the darkness. It was clear that they hadn't come for a friendly chat. Lisa quietly suggested we retreat and contact the authorities, but just as we began to back away, the men turned in our direction. Their flashlights pierced the night, revealing their menacing faces. Fear gripped us, and without a word, we fled the scene and returned to our campsite. We couldn't shake the feeling that they were following us, and paranoia kept us awake through the night. As dawn broke, we decided it was time to leave. We quickly packed our belongings, leaving behind the campsite we had come to love. As we drove away, I glanced back at the serene lake, now forever tainted by the presence of those uninvited guests. To this day, we wonder what their intentions were, and what could have happened if we hadn't acted swiftly. 6th story, The Mysterious Disappearance of Sarah Lewis by Anonymous. In the summer of 2016, I embarked on a solo camping trip in the Cairngorms National Park in Scotland. It was supposed to be a week of solitude and self-discovery, but it turned into a chilling mystery I can't forget. I set up my camp in a secluded spot deep within the forest, a place I believed no one else would stumble upon. The first few days were peaceful, with me immersing myself in the beauty of nature. But on the fourth night, I heard something that made my blood run cold. I was reading a book by the campfire when I heard a faint, eerie sound in the distance. It was unlike anything I had heard before, a soft, high-pitched melody that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at the same time. I put down my book, straining to locate the source of the sound. It was as if the forest itself was singing, and it sent a shiver down my spine. I grabbed my flashlight and ventured into the woods, following the haunting tune. The further I went, the louder the music became, but I couldn't find its origin. As I ventured deeper into the woods, the melody led me to a small clearing. In the center, there was a circle of stones, arranged in a peculiar pattern. At the center of the circle, a single red rose lay, untouched by the elements. It was as if it had been placed there with purpose. The eerie melody continued, emanating from the stones themselves. Fear clutched at me as I realized that I was no longer alone. A figure, cloaked in shadow, stood at the edge of the clearing, watching me. I could make out no features, just a looming presence. I fled back to my campsite, my heart pounding in my chest. I packed up my belongings and left that place behind, never looking back. To this day, I can't explain what happened in those woods, but the memory of that haunting melody and the shadowy figure still haunts my dreams. 7th story, The Lost Hikers by Robert Taylor. In the summer of 2015, my friends and I decided to take a camping trip in the remote forests of the Ozark Mountains in Arkansas. We were looking forward to a week of hiking and exploring, but what awaited us was a nightmare we couldn't have anticipated. Our group consisted of 4 people: me, Robert, Sarah, Steve, and Jenny. We had picked a remote trailhead to begin our adventure, and the first few days were filled with exhilarating hikes and breathtaking vistas. But on the 4th day, we ventured deeper into the woods than we had ever gone before, and that's when things started to go terribly wrong. As we trekked through the dense forest, we realized that we had lost our way. Panic set in as we tried to retrace our steps, but the landscape was unfamiliar, and our maps seemed utterly useless. It was as if the forest itself was shifting, conspiring to keep us lost. The hours passed, and the sun began to dip below the horizon. Fear gnawed at us as we realized that we were deep in the wilderness, with no way of finding our way back to the trailhead. Desperation set in, and we decided to make camp for the night. As we huddled around the campfire, trying to stay warm, a feeling of unease settled over us. We couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, and strange sounds echoed through the trees. It was as if the forest was coming alive with a malevolent presence. In the dead of night, our tent started shaking violently. We screamed, thinking it was an animal, but as we unzipped the tent, we were met with something far more sinister. In the darkness, we could see a group of people surrounding our camp, their faces twisted with malice. They said nothing, but their intentions were clear. They were there to intimidate us, to make us leave, or worse. The situation was dire, and we knew we had to get out of there. In the chaos, we managed to escape our campsite and make a run for it. We stumbled through the forest, driven by pure fear. Hours passed before we finally found our way back to the trailhead. We reported the incident to the authorities, but they could never locate the group of people who had terrorized us. To this day, we can't explain who they were or what they wanted, but the memory of those twisted faces still haunts us. 8th story, The Abandoned Campsite by Emily Parker. It was the summer of 2019, and my husband, Brian, and I decided to take a camping trip to the Shenandoah National Park in Virginia. We were looking forward to a romantic getaway, but what we found was a chilling mystery that defied explanation. We had chosen a secluded campsite by a tranquil stream, away from the more popular areas. The first few days were filled with hikes, stargazing, and cozy nights by the campfire. But on the 4th day, we stumbled upon an abandoned campsite that would change our peaceful retreat into a nightmare. As we explored the forest, we came across an empty campsite. It was as if the campers had left in a hurry, leaving behind their tents, belongings, and a smoldering campfire. The scene was eerie, and we couldn't help but wonder why anyone would abandon a campsite in such a pristine location. We decided to investigate further, hoping to find some clues as to what had transpired. As we examined the area, we came across a journal that had been left behind. Its pages were filled with unsettling entries, written in a frantic and disjointed manner. The author described hearing strange sounds at night, whispers in the darkness, and the sensation of being watched. They spoke of a looming presence in the forest, one that filled them with dread. It was clear that the camper had been driven to leave their campsite by an overwhelming sense of fear. As we continued to read, we heard a rustling in the woods, and our hearts jumped. We looked around but saw no one. Panic set in as we realized that we were not alone, and someone was lurking in the shadows. We made a hasty retreat from the abandoned campsite, leaving the journal behind. As we returned to our camp, the feeling of being watched never left us. The forest, once a place of tranquility, now felt sinister, and we couldn't shake the fear that someone was out there, watching and waiting. We packed up our camp and left, the memory of the abandoned campsite and the unsettling journal haunting us. To this day, we can't explain what happened in those woods or who the author of the journal was, but the feeling of being watched remains etched in our memories. 9th story, The Menacing Howls of the Pinnacle Forest by Thomas Wright. In the summer of 2014, I took a camping trip to Pinnacle National Park in Tennessee. The promise of solitude and stunning views was too enticing to resist. However, my experience took an unnerving turn that I will never forget. I set up camp near the edge of a cliff with a panoramic view of the forest below. The first few days were idyllic, filled with hiking, photography, and peaceful evenings by the campfire. But on the 4th night, the tranquility of the park was shattered by a series of chilling howls. As I sat by the campfire, I heard the eerie, otherworldly cries echoing through the forest. It was as if the very trees themselves were wailing in agony. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end as I strained to pinpoint the source of the sound. The howls grew louder, and I realized they were coming from a direction I had not explored yet. Trepidation washed over me as I ventured into the woods, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The closer I got, the more disturbing the howls became, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I reached a small clearing and stopped dead in my tracks. There, I saw a group of men in a circle, chanting and howling at the moon. They were dressed in tattered clothes, their faces obscured by masks, and their behavior was erratic, to say the least. I watched in horror as they continued their ritual, their howls growing more frenzied with each passing moment. It was as if they were summoning something dark and malevolent from the depths of the forest. The sight was enough to make me retreat to my campsite, my heart pounding in my chest. I remained hidden in my tent, paralyzed with fear, as the howls continued deep into the night. It felt as though the very essence of the forest had shifted, tainted by the presence of those men. The next morning, I packed up my camp and left, my mind filled with questions about who those men were and what they had been doing in the heart of the Pinnacle National Park. The memory of those menacing howls still sends shivers down my spine. 10th story, The Forest of Whispers by Laura Mitchell. In the summer of 2017, my friends and I embarked on a camping trip to the dense woods of Black Forest in Germany. We were excited for a week of adventure and exploration, but what we encountered was a mystery that still haunts us. Our group consisted of 4 people: me, Laura, Paul, Sarah, and Ben. We had chosen a remote spot deep within the forest to escape the crowds and have an authentic experience. The first few days were filled with hiking, foraging, and stargazing. But on the 4th night, our peaceful retreat turned into a nightmare. As we gathered around the campfire, the forest seemed to come alive with strange sounds. It was as if the trees were whispering secrets to one another. We dismissed it as the wind, but the unease in the air refused to dissipate. The whispers grew louder and took on an eerie, melodic quality, as if the forest itself was singing a haunting tune. Fear gripped us as we realized that there was something unnatural about those whispers. It felt as if they were trying to lure us deeper into the forest. Curiosity got the best of us, and we decided to investigate, leaving our campfire behind. We followed the whispers, each step taking us deeper into the woods. The voices grew more distinct, but the words were in a language we couldn't understand. As we approached a small clearing, the whispers stopped abruptly, and a deep silence settled over the forest. In the center of the clearing, we found a ring of mushrooms, arranged in a perfect circle. It was an unnatural sight, and we couldn't help but feel that we had stumbled upon something ancient and malevolent. We retreated to our campsite, unable to shake the feeling that the forest was watching us. The atmosphere grew oppressive, and we decided to pack up and leave. The forest, once a place of wonder, had become a place of dread. As we made our way back to civilization, we couldn't explain the strange phenomenon we had encountered in the Black Forest. The memory of those haunting whispers and the mysterious circle of mushrooms still haunts our thoughts to this day. Thank you for sticking with us through the whole video. Also, I recommend you this video you see on screen, one of the scariest on my channel. If you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe and like this video. This helps me bring you more thrilling content every day. If this video sent shivers down your spine, let me know in the comments.